whispers from the past. He knew
There's probably no family in this area or in the whole of the UK that hasn't been affected by the Great War. I know as I was growing up, I always had a photo of my grandfather in his service uniform of the period 1914 to 1918. And I always thought that he'd fought on the Western Front. But it was only when I asked my brother, my older brother, some questions that I discovered that he hadn't fought on the Western Front. He'd actually seen service in Ireland during 1916 and during the Easter Rising. It's these things that we can only find out by asking questions. And it's really been an honour to listen to people's stories and to archive these stories. And I hope for future generations, these seemingly insignificant stories will become very important. And I hope that when you watch the following programme, you will be inspired to ask questions.
Find the general, I know where he is. He's pinning another medal on his chest. I saw him, pinning another medal on his chest. Pinning another
William
medal
Gunther.
on his chest.
He's born in 1892, and when he's 2 years old, he's actually a match boy. So he's born into poverty. And then he went into the First World War. He got gassed. That's kind of all we know about that situation. Never really talked about it. Went through into the Second World War. But it wasn't until he was the age of 96 we found out something else about him, which no one knew, not even his wife. He used to, every week he used to go across the road to the shops to buy himself a bottle of brandy for the week. And one day he got run over and he was rushed into hospital. They'd done a series of tests and they scanned his head for any sort of head injuries and things like that. And they found shrapnel in his head. And when they asked him, he says, that happened in the First World War, but didn't want to say anything to make a fuss at all.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know.
Frederick George Hammond, known as Fred. He served with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He was wounded. I still have the piece of shrapnel dug out of his leg, and he was also gassed. He said very little about his war experiences to my grandmother, from whom I've heard, because his grandfather died just a couple of months before I was born. But she kept a lot of things of his, including a piece of biscuit that he sent home from the front with a note on it that said, "Your king and country need you, and this is how they feed you."
Well, I brought along today a couple of postcards from the First World War. That's the first one. This is from my great-grandfather, Lawrence Buttigieg, sent to his wife, Giovanna. We are, as I said, a Maltese descent, like. So this is, it says, "My dear wife, this is the postcard of the first action with the German warships and their German cruisers, the small ones going down to the bottom of the sea, on the 28th of August 1914. In this action we didn't lost nothing, but the Germans lost about 5 ships, and thank God for that. So I hope you'll save this postcard forever. from your loving husband, LB signs it, which is Lawrence BUTTIGIEG.
Mama can't show her face. Take you back up Bristol way. They'll go easy on the young. There's no such luck for you, my boy. Take you back to face the dawn. Well, there's no such luck for you, my boy. Take you back to face the gun.
Tommy was an ambulance driver. He survived till the Third Battle of Ypres, when he was killed when he was transporting wounded soldiers from the front back to the ambulance. He was 21 years old and he died on the 24th of July 1917. He's buried in Canada Farm, and one day I will go there and see him. And if you can see just at the bottom, I think it's your right hand corner, that poppy leaf has come from Ypres, a service that my parents went to. So this hangs on the wall of my home. I think about him every time I walk past, and I want to know more.
We'll have a barrel of fun. Roll out the barrel. We've got the blues on the run. Sing boom terraro. Bring out the song of the chair. Now's the time to roll a barrel.
Yes, both my grandfathers, very, very different. My father's father was in the Royal Engineers, and I have some very, very good photographs of my grandfather, but he was a very, very tall man. He was stood over 6'6", and in his full uniform, he's standing about a head and shoulders above most of the people he's with when they're actually on parade. He was very, very tall, huge, and from what I remember, he had hands like shovels. My mother's father, on the other hand, was quite different. He was less than 5 foot in height. Signed in Liverpool and became a bantam, one of the bantams, which of course were, because they were short, they were used for tunnelling. So that's, you know, the two different sides of the coin. We had the tall and the short of it, to be honest with you.
I saw him, pinning another medal on his chest, pinning another medal on his chest. If you want to find the Colonel, I know where he is, I know where he is, I know where he is. If you want to find the Colonel, I know where he is. He's sitting in comfort, stuffing his bloody guard.
My great-grandfather's name was Albert Phillips, and this is all we knew about him until shortly before my grandfather died, and he died in 2002. We knew he was killed in action during the First World War, but that's all. We knew absolutely nothing more about him. We did know at some point he was in the cavalry, and we did have the name of his later regiment. I believe it was the Queen's Regiment. When my grandfather was very ill, the local GP came round to visit him and said they started talking about history and where they'd been, and the story came out that my great-grandfather was somewhere in France and nobody in the family knew where. So the doctor said, well, you can now access through the internet the War Graves Commission, and you can find out if you know some detail about him. So we did have the Queen's Regiment, and we knew his name, and we knew obviously that he died sometime during the First World War, but we didn't know when. And then lo and behold, I had quite a magic moment with my mother standing over my shoulder, and she'd never obviously met her grandfather. And I went on the internet and the War Graves site came up, and we tracked him down, and there his name was. And we found out that he was actually killed in action in Arras. There is no known grave, but his name is on the commemorative wall in Arras. Unfortunately, my grandfather then died, but he did know that his own father had been killed in action in 1917 in Arras. So the story was put to one side for a few years, and then eventually in 2008, I took my parents, my father and my mother, over to Arras. We had a stormy crossing. It was it was November the 10th. We had quite a stormy crossing. We drove down to Arras and we found the site, we found the cemetery with the graves, and we found this commemorative wall. My vivid memory is just walking round the wall, one corner, turning another corner, and the names were just endless, and I just wanted it to end. We found his name under the Queen's Regiment. The height of the wall, I couldn't tell you in metres, but it was certainly twice my height. But my great-grandfather's name was within arm's reach for my mother. So she was wearing a poppy at the time, remember the date, the 10th of November, and she was able to take her poppy off and pin it alongside his name. The following day then we had a very, very emotional commemorative 11th of November with French there and the Canadians, because a lot of Canadians lost their lives in the nearby Vimy Ridge, I understand. It was very moving. The local dignitaries, the mayor, were there from Arras, and we stood shoulder to shoulder with another British couple, and her great-grandfather had been missing as well, and she had a similar story to tell. And then there were a few Canadians. Incredibly moving ceremony. I suppose the memory I take away from it is of that morning, standing there, and as you leave or as you approach the war graves, the site, the commemorative wall, there is an orb, a sculptured orb, and it is of the planet, and it's set in orbit, in position as it would have been on the 11th hour of the 11th day, 1918, on the Armistice Day.
First thing I'd like to mention is my wife, Rhian Harcombe. Her uncle, great uncle, died at Metz Woods 100 years ago today. His name was Bethel Harcombe. He served with the 15th Battalion Welsh Regiment. His service number was 21769. He fought at Metz Wood. This was a few days into the Battle of the Somme. He died on the 10th of July 1916. His body was never found. He is remembered on the Thiepval Memorial.
In July 1916, my grandfather was fighting alongside Harry and the rest of the 8th Battalion in Metz. He was lucky to be one of the 50% who survived. He also survived the rest of the Somme offensive. There's a picture of my grandfather, Tom Wallace, in his uniform before he went to the front. After another year at the front, Tom was actually captured in northeastern France and became a POW for the next 15 months until he was repatriated. He came back home to Salop Street in Penarth with 3 medals. There's 1, the Star, 2, the British War Medal, I think that's the right one, and a 3rd one, the Victory Medal, which has since been lost.
This was taught to me by a lady who had Alzheimer's. She was in a wheelchair when I met her. From the neck down I thought she was fine. I said, hello, what's your name? And the carer said, don't talk to her, she never talks. Within a couple of sessions, suddenly I heard this noise from at the back, and I was playing Daisy Daisy, and she sang a whole verse 2 of Daisy Daisy. So I'd like to share that in memory of that lovely lady. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer, do. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can't afford a carriage, but you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle made for 2. Dandy, dandy, the coppers are after you. If they catch you, they'll give you a month or 2. They'll tie you up with wire behind a black Mariah. So ring the bell and pedal like hell on a bicycle made for 2.
Ready, lads? Best man, remember? Out! Out! Come on, lads! Out!
He became a recruiting sergeant, having recovered from his wounds. And he recruited in and around the Carmarthenshire area, and was quite a well-known figure apparently in Carmarthenshire. And there are 1 or 2, well, rather colourful stories, let's say, about him. One of which I'll refer to he was in. And this is reported in one of the newspapers at the time, I think it was 1915, that he'd been giving this recruiting speech in Fishguard. And it was full of phrases like, if you're not fit to live, you're not fit to die, and if you're not fit to die, you're not fit to live. I'm not quite sure what that means really, but still, it obviously made sense at the time. Now, it just so happened that there was a travelling menagerie, something you don't get now. A menagerie of, animals. And Fuller was making this speech, and he was challenged by members in the crowd to, if he was so brave, why didn't he just go into the lion's den, which was presumably just alongside him. Now then. And Fuller, being a somewhat larger-than-life character, obviously threw off his hat and strode into the lion's den and stroked a lion's mane. Now, whether this story is true or not, because it's topped off in the paper by saying that the proprietors of the menagerie was so astounded by this feat that they gave him a gold medal. Now, whether they just happen to have a gold medal lying about at the time, it's not really said.
the days are long. Twilight.
Mobilisation booklet of my grandfather. That is a photograph of him in 1917. Very fresh young man, and you know, this was taken on the 21st of April, and it sends a shiver down my arms now to think that he's younger than my son at the moment, and my son is in university, and yet he was fighting the Germans for survival. Yeah, and it's trying to keep things happy for his wife. Well, my grandmother, which is a tender name, is Babon, and a sincere souvenir, and that's from Edmond, that is his name. And you know, it was nice to think that they had time to write letters and stuff home to their loved ones, which they had to leave behind. But during the war, they defended the Easter Banks, and my grandfather was an engineer, as I've told you before, but he was an aerostier. Now, that is a name that is a French name, and that involved the company being involved in the observation balloons that were raised up, and they observed the movements of the enemy. Obviously, being attached to engineers, I would have thought he was be instrumental in opening the locks and closing the locks, and you know, doing all the engineering work that needed to be done, you know, the trenches, etc. And I would have thought, because it was a small army, he'd have his rifle with him and his armaments, etc. His company and he were awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is one of the country's highest honours for bravery. According to his citation, they were at the front for 52 months. Now, I couldn't quite understand that, because it's 1914, 1918. That didn't mount up. But then when you realise that they were at the front before the English and the French got involved, they were defending their country. And, you know, just to think that this medal is the Croix de Guerre, and dare I say, with oak leaves. And I think there's avec le lion en bronze, which means that he was mentioned a couple of times in dispatches for other acts of bravery.
Bosses of chocolate, bosses of pink. Eat any more, I'll get stomach ache. Bring it over here, let's get sober. Baby Duff, but I'm a one fat soldier. Gotta have a strong constitution if you're gonna live it down.
During the Battle of Passchendaele, before the move to Italy, Fred gained the honour of being awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his gallantry, which was listed in the London Gazette on the 28th of March 1918. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, in volunteering 3 times to go on patrol. He drove in a small enemy covering party and accurately located 2 machine guns, though under a heavy fire, in daylight. Later, he brought in many wounded, and though himself wounded, refused to withdraw until ordered to do so." Sadly, just 2 days later, on the 30th of March 1918, Fred was accidentally killed whilst on a training exercise. He was 21 years old and is buried in Padua, Main Cemetery, Italy, in grave B5.
he had illness again and was sent back to London, so he spent some time in a London hospital because he was suffering from neurasthenia, which I had no idea what that was, so you look that up, and that was a nervous breakdown, or maybe post-traumatic stress you'd call it these days. And it was more than likely linked to a story that came down from him through the family, where he and another soldier were on a nighttime guard duty, being the armed guard over a food depot, and they had to sort of prevent anybody coming into this depot. And one night they challenged somebody who was clearly trying to break in, and for them to stop and identify themselves, and this person didn't, was either continuing to get in, maybe not understanding what they were being told, and both of the guards on duty, Grumpy and the other guy, they both opened fire, and this person fell dead. And when they rushed over and had a look, it was a woman. And it just broke him up, and he lived with that story. They never knew, so the story goes, which of them had fired that shot, but I think he perhaps believed firmly that it was him, because he's very well known to have been a very keen shot with both an air rifle for rabbit hunting, and even with stones, and stuff like that. He was absolutely fantastic, a proper countryman. So he believed it was him, and it just wrecked him. And it made me think, that many people saw the most horrendous things and lived through horrific kind of events. But how many men in the First World War, how many soldiers would have killed a woman? Just so weird and so unusual.
I know where he is, I know where he is. If you want to find the private, I know where he is. He's hanging on the old barbed wire. I saw him hanging on.
So I asked my mother who was John Rees, and she said, "Oh, it was your father's eldest brother." And I said, "Well, why haven't I heard of him? I know the rest of the family. We lived with my Uncle Willie. I've met the two sisters who went to Canada, and I've heard a great deal about my Aunt Olwen, who died of TB at the age of 22. Why haven't I heard of John Rees?" And my mother said, "Oh, he came home from the First World War and was taken to the asylum in Carmarthen." I subsequently found my grandfather's letter book in the same bookcase, and in time read it, and there's a copy of a letter in it that he sent to the pensions office in London, and I'm going to read it out. "Dear Sir, reference to Private John Rees, 241026, 4th 5th Welsh Regiment. He joined the army on the 8th of October 1914, served in the Dardanelles, Egypt and Palestine, was disembodied November last, reached home the beginning of February 1919, received a weekly payment 3 times after, also a lump sum of about £24. He has not been able to do any work since he came home because his brain has been affected, and to our great sorrow we have been obliged to place him in a lunatic asylum, where he was taken last Friday. Today I have received a notice from the relieving officer of the poor demanding payment from me for his time in accompanying my son to the asylum, also a charge for the doctor and the policeman. My son is 25 years of age. I have kept him since February. Seeing that my son's health has been shattered in the army, am I liable to pay the above-mentioned expenses? Yours faithfully, Thomas Rees, his father, 63 years of age. I questioned my mother a bit more about my uncle, but she'd never met him. She hadn't met my father until my poor Uncle John had been taken to Carmarthen. But she did remember that my grandmother had visited him regularly, and that after my grandmother's death, my father had gone to visit him regularly. I said, well, you know, my grandmother died in 1940, and she said, oh, that's right. She said, she died in May, and your uncle died in September. So my poor uncle had been in Carmarthen Asylum from 1919 to 1940. No, that is bad enough in itself, but what I think is even more cruel is that he had been erased from the family memory. I should have known about him. He had been a hero in his way. Anybody fighting in Gallipoli, Palestine, and the Dardanelles had seen hell. I asked various neighbours if they remembered him. One vaguely remembered him as a nice, quiet boy. So this nice, quiet boy, who had worked in the local coal mine, probably hadn't gone further than Swansea or Llanelli, had been thrown into the First World War and seen scenes that had affected his mind. And he should have been honoured as other people were honoured. If he had died, his name would have been inscribed on monuments, but because he was in a mental home, he was just, if not forgotten, certainly never talked about. And I resent this bitterly. I should have known about my uncle. And even if I can't do anything else, if I can just give these few minutes to resurrect his name, to pay tribute to what he had done and what he had suffered, and also to the many who suffered like him.